Welcome to the Exodus Cry podcast, where we have honest conversations around exploitation, trafficking, sexual culture, and justice.
It's an honor to have you on our podcast, Sheila. I read your book, The Great Sex Rescue, and I was struck by many things in this book. I think for me, having read like a few books on the subject of sexuality, meaning dozens, you kind of get to a point where you feel like you've heard it all. And I think what you've uncovered in your book is something that is just deeply insightful and maybe something that few have considered. And so we live in an hour in a generation where people's approach to sex has been affected by many things, and it's changed so much. And I would just love to get into sort of the subject matter and the topic of your book, specifically as it pertains to the evangelical message around sex, the implications of that for women, and sort of what you prescribe around that. I know it's a big question,
okay,
but given that sort of like larger landscape, I would love to, just for you to kind of to jump in and just maybe begin to unpack some of that.
Yeah. So what we did for the Great Sex Rescue is we did do something different. This is what makes our book different: is
research.
We actually decided, hey, what if we talk to people instead of just saying what my opinion is? So we surveyed 20,000 women, which
only
is a
20,000.
Yeah, 20,000. I know. And we got really up close and personal, 130 questions minimum. So if they were married more than once, they had more than that. And we were asking marital satisfaction, sexual pain. We asked them all those questions. But then what we did was we presented them with several teachings, which are really common in evangelical circles. So we were able to look at women who did believe this stuff and women who didn't believe this stuff and see if it impacted marital and sexual satisfaction. And we identified a number of teachings that are really common in the church that hurt women quite substantially.
Can you just talk? First of all, I love that approach of like, we're not going to assume that because we read a few Bible verses or, a couple books that we know it all. And just now we're going to give our perspective. I love that you approach the subject from the perspective of curiosity, like genuinely wanting to know people's lived experiences. I think that's a lot of of our journey at Exodus Cry, really digging in and trying to research and understand the impact of the global commercial sex industry on our world. And so before we get into kind of some of the findings of your research, can you talk just for a moment about some of the consistent teachings that you refer to that people are getting if they're in the church, if they've grown up with exposure to the evangelical church?
Okay, I'm going to list a couple. And here's what I'm going to ask you, Benji. Does this sound familiar in porn? So I'm going to give you the teaching,
right. But
then you tell me if you've also seen this idea in porn. So a woman is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a common porn thing too, right? Because porn is about, it's not about women's agency. It's about the fact that women's bodies exist to be used by men.
Mm.
And that is a teaching that's really common in the church too. I think it's a misreading of Bible verses, but these things have come into the church so that our church culture actually resembles porn in a lot of ways with the way that we look at sex. So there's one. Regarding porn, we teach women that you are responsible to give your husband lots of sex so that he won't watch porn. So the way to stop a porn habit is just to give him enough sex that he's sated and he doesn't need to go look at that anymore, which doesn't work. We can get into that later, but yeah, it doesn't work. Or even all men struggle with lust. It's every man's battle. Again, very common thing that we see in porn, that this is just what all men want. Or the idea that is often taught to teens, both girls and boys, that boys are going to push girls' sexual boundaries. And so girls, you need to be the gatekeeper. And all of those messages we found were very common. So there was a significant minority that believed that believed each of them, although there was a majority when it came to lust, and all of them had really negative effects on women's marital and sexual satisfaction.
So let's break that down one by one. So starting at the outset with the first one, the way that I write about that particular subject in Raised on Porn, my book on this subject of pornography and its impact on us, is through this idea that in the porn like universe, there is a porn man and a porn woman, and then the porn universe. And so this idea that pornographers cast both men and women into very consistent roles in which they are expected to carry out like a fulfillment of that particular role. And in the case of men, that looks like one thing. In the case of women, that looks like another thing. But in the case of women, it's this, the one thing that's common between them is they're both emptied of their humanity. And so she exists for the sole purpose of being acted upon and participating in and loving and accepting, every sexual advance, on and on. So I think part of what I hear you saying in that first one is just this idea that women exist for men's sexual pleasure, that sex is not about their pleasure or their subjectivity or their interest, histories, experiences, preferences, things that they may not like, but it's just you exist for men's sexual pleasure. I think that's part of what I heard in your first point of analysis. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit more? So this idea that is taught in the evangelical church that women are obligated to engage in sex with their...
Okay, I'm going to back up for a minute. Okay, because there's even a more fundamental question. I'm going to get to yours, but there's a more fundamental one. And that's, what is sex?
Okay.
Because everything hinges on that. Because when we see sex, if you ask the average person on the street, what is sex? First of all, they're going to think you're creepy. But if they actually try to define it, it would be something like an IKEA furniture, like tab A goes into slot B, right? So what they describe as intercourse. That definition means that we see sex from a male lens. Because intercourse, the only thing we know about intercourse is that it's going to end with his climax, right? She could be lying there making a grocery list in her head. She could be in emotional turmoil. She could be in physical pain. She could even be being coerced, and it would still count as sex. What if that isn't the right definition? And what if that's the heart of the problem? Because if we're seeing sex as simply a physical act that he does to her, then her experience is erased, and it only has to do with bodies. And I don't actually think that that's the biblical view of sex. And I know not everyone listening goes by the Bible. That's okay. But there is a verse in Genesis 4. It's talking about the Adam and Eve story. And it's kind of a funny verse. It says, Adam knew his wife Eve, and they conceived a son. And I remember hearing this in junior high and thinking this was hilarious because, God's embarrassed of using the real word for sex there. But when I got older and I looked at it, that Hebrew root for to know, that is the same root that's used elsewhere in Scripture. Like when David says, search me and know me, oh God. Know my inmost heart. Sex is not just physical. It's this deep intimacy, this deep longing to be connected, which means that both of you have to matter. It's not just about your bodies. When two people show up at the bedroom, they're supposed to be coming with everything that they are, and even the fact that we're naked. And if you want to take that as a metaphor, like we're being vulnerable, I'm taking my masks off. I want you to see everything about me. That's the ideal. I'm not saying that is what sex is necessarily, but I think that's the ideal, that it is this deep knowing. We know from elsewhere in Scripture, it's pleasurable for both. Like in Song of Songs, she's having a good time. She says more than he does. She's having a good time. And then there is this picture of mutuality in some verses that get really misused in 1 Corinthians 7. So, you see this picture of something which is mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both. That's what it is supposed to be.
I love to just kind of put an exclamation point on your point. I love this thing that Father Gillick says. He's this really deep, blind Jesuit priest and an amazing person, and I just love some of his teaching so much. But he says this thing. He says, we would rather take our clothes off and have sex than we would take off our masks and actually be known. Yeah. And so, so there is this idea of like that you're talking about, which is sort of a deeper realization, a deeper understanding of what sex is, that's centered around mutuality, intimacy, the true and authentic connectivity of two human beings in this like very mysterious act.
Right. Okay. So now let's get back to your other question. So if sex is supposed to be something which is intimate and mutual, but we see sex as something which is only about, her body and his body, and they're connecting, and he has the right to use her body however he wants, then sex is no longer a deep knowing. Sex is actually an erasing of her as a person. Because if sex is supposed to be a deep knowing, then it has to mean that she matters, that what she thinks matters, that what she feels matters, that what she wants matters. But if she's obligated to give him something, if she exists for him to use, then none of those things matter anymore. So instead of sex being this thing where you intimately know each other, it becomes this deeply impersonal experience. It's an erasure of her as a person. And him as a person too, by the way. But it's completely depersonalized. And that's why, when people say, oh, we should just have more sex so that the desire for porn goes away. It doesn't work. Yeah. Sex and porn are polar opposites. Because porn is a using. And sex is supposed to be a knowing. And you can't substitute those two. Okay,
so I see how you're getting from point 1 to point 2 there. Just to kind of tease out point 1 a little bit more. And I love that distinction between using versus knowing. Teasing out point 1 a little bit more. You referenced 1 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul's idea that two people in a marriage should not deprive one another of sex. So here's a question that I have for you about this idea of obligation. So the decision to get married is in some sense an offering on both parts of obligation. Like I'm in a way obligating my body to you, you're obligating your body to me. I don't know if that's the right language, but at some level, and understanding that we're going to share every aspect of life together, including our bodies. And so I think if I'm understanding you correctly, the mindset that you're addressing is the mindset of, let's just say, the partner who maybe has a bigger sex drive, a more intense sex drive, whatever. So in any relationship, and it could go either way. One person may have a lower sex drive, one person may have a greater sex drive. So for the person with the greater sex drive to internalize a verse like 1 Corinthians 7, don't deprive each other of sex, as a means to say to his partner, well, you don't want to have sex, but too bad for you, because this Bible verse says that you're obligated. So yeah. So I think that's probably, if I'm understanding you correctly, more the danger that we want to address. And how does that, first of all, can you speak to that? Like, does that resonate? Is that?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the biggest thing that you hear. And I think this is so funny. I think this whole argument is so funny that people make, because if you look at almost any Christian marriage book about sex, or marriage book in general that talks about sex, the big thing they're trying to solve is how do we get women to have more sex, right? We need to pressure women to have sex. We need to tell women, look, sex is a gift from God, darn it. Why aren't you enjoying it more? And you need to go have it with your husband because it's a gift and you need to celebrate it. And I find this really odd, because if you were to put a chocolate cake in front of me right now, you would not have to tell me chocolate cake is a gift from God, Sheila. You need to eat it. Like, what you would have to tell me is, Sheila, I know it looks really good, but you don't have to have it all right now. Like, try to show a little bit of restraint, right? Because chocolate cake is awesome. Mm-hmm. So if something is this great, Why in the world are we yelling at women to have more of it? Why wouldn't women want it? Like, why doesn't this clue into us that, hey, if she doesn't want it, maybe there's a reason. And that's what we found in our survey, is that this idea that women are just selfish and just get married and then decide to give up on sex, it's just not true. It doesn't happen. Maybe in a very, very few cases. But on the whole, it does not happen. Frequency is a symptom. It is not the problem. Frequency is a sign that there is something wrong with your relationship. So if someone just doesn't want sex, there's a reason. And so figure out what the reason is. And what we found, I'm going to list 5 things. So y'all just take notes here, okay? But when women have high marital satisfaction, when they feel emotionally close during sex, so they don't feel like they're being used, they don't feel depersonalized, when there's no sexual dysfunction, so no sexual pain, he doesn't have erectile dysfunction, when there's no porn use in the marriage, and when she frequently reaches orgasm, frequency takes care of itself. So instead of saying to women, hey, you're depriving him, we need to start asking, okay, if someone doesn't want sex, there's a reason. Because sex is great. So let's figure out that reason. Because in general, women don't want to have sex that's bad.
Yeah.
Women just don't want bad sex.
Yeah.
So let's figure out why it's bad.
So getting into the psychology of that passage, this idea of don't deprive each other. So if I am the partner in the relationship who has less of a sex drive, what's the right way to internalize a passage like that psychologically? And let's just say, because of, again, not everybody's going to fit into this, but I think most frequently it's the male partner who has a stronger sex drive than the female part. In most cases, there are cases where that switches. I'm aware of that. But in the case, let's just say for women, how do they internalize a passage like that, and how does that affect them?
Yeah, so just to put numbers to it, we found that 58% of men have the higher sex drive in a marriage, 19% of women do, and in 23% it's pretty shared. So
okay.
Yeah, so it is mostly men with the higher, but not a huge majority, which is interesting to begin with. I think a healthy way to look at that passage is that a healthy marriage should have a healthy sex life. Like, a healthy sex life is part of a healthy marriage. And so if you're married and you're getting along well, we should be celebrating sex, not just because of what it does for your partner, but also because it's really great for you. Helps you sleep better. There's lower rates of mental health problems. Like, you feel closer. There's all kinds of amazing benefits to sex. It feels good. It lowers your stress. So let's figure out how to prioritize this more. Let's figure out how to get more sleep so you're not as exhausted. Let's just figure out how to put more fun in your marriage. Absolutely. But sex on its own cannot solve marriage problems. And the problem is that so many people, it's like what you said, that great quote by the father, that many
Father
people would
Gillick,
rather
take the clothes off and have sex.
Yes.
And call that, yeah.
Yeah, that I think so. What's happened is so many people channel all of their needs for intimacy and emotional intimacy into sex because they don't know how to be emotionally vulnerable in any other way. And that makes sex really impersonal. Because it's like, you want to know my body, but you don't want to know me. Because it allows people, especially the guy in this case, and it might not always be the guy, but the person who's doing it that way, it allows them to feel like they're close without having to do the work of being close. And eventually that's going to feel like a rejection. And I think we found it's either 18% or 16%. I'm not the stats person on my book. We have 3 co-authors because we all did different parts of the book. So this is off the top of my head. But I think it's either 16% or 18% of women said that their primary emotion after sex was feeling used. So for them, not having sex would make them feel closer than having sex. Because there's already a problem in the relationship. But then you have sex and you actually feel even worse. So So it's not like sex can fix problems. We've got to make sure that we're actually able to be emotionally intimate and vulnerable.
Okay, there's one part of the quote that I left out, and this makes it even better.
Okay.
He said, I always do this whenever I try to quote things off the top of my head. I butcher them the first time. He said, "We would rather take our clothes off and have sex and call that intimacy than we would take off our masks and actually be known." So that's, I get, but I think it just reinforces the point that you're making even more. So in your book, you elaborate on this point even more. This idea that for people who do subscribe to a Christian faith, there's this idea, and maybe other faiths as well, that you're not supposed to have sex before you get married.
Yeah.
But then on the night that you get married, and from then on, you are supposed to have sex. So the idea of obligation that enters from the moment that you get married, that you're told this powerful, mysterious part of yourself, the switch is to be turned off, and then from the moment that you get married, it is to be turned on. And so on the side of the equation for the partner with the lower sex drive, the idea that I am supposed to have sex, I am obligated to have sex. In your findings, how does that affect the sexuality of that person with the lower sex drive?
Yeah, so we've got a whole lot of things that can do to someone when they approach sex as an obligation. So when it
helps a bunch, right? Because they're like, oh, well, since I'm supposed to.
There is one way that it does help.
Okay.
It makes sex more frequent. Everything else is terrible, but it makes sex more frequent. And I sometimes wonder if that's enough for the people that are pushing this message. Like, is that all they care about? That he gets enough sex? And what she feels doesn't matter. Because I'll tell you what it does to her. It lowers her orgasm rates. It lowers her marital satisfaction. It can increase divorce rates. But the most interesting finding that I think is the most telling is that it increases the rates of sexual pain. Now, there's a sexual pain disorder called vaginismus. Hardly anyone has ever heard of this. Everyone knows what erectile dysfunction is. Hardly anyone knows vaginismus, although it's way more common in those under the age of 40. And we've known for 50 years in the gynecological literature that religiously conservative women, specifically evangelical, suffer from this at twice the rate of the general population. In fact, we found an incidence rate of 22.6%. So this is huge. 7% that penetration is so painful, it's impossible. Okay, so this is huge. And when you believe the obligation sex message, your chance of experiencing vaginismus increases to almost the same statistical effect as if you had been abused. So the obligation sex message, our bodies interpret that as trauma. We literally see that as trauma.
Wow. That's super powerful. So there's two sides to this. There's the way in which the mentality that says on the part of the partner with the higher sex drive, mentality says, well, you are, after all, obligated, so too bad. Like, there's that mentality of entitlement. And we can understand that how destructive that can be. Then there's the mentality of the person who is with the lower sex drive, who is in their minds saying, well, I'm obligated. And you've just described the way in which that can really damage that person's sexuality. So I just want to develop one other thread of this, and that I would love for you to speak to before we move on to points 2, 3, and 4. So, and that is the thread of the person who, there's a lower sex drive and a higher sex drive partner, and the person with the lower sex drive says, hey, like, I read Sheila's book. I'm done with that mindset that I'm obligated to this. Sorry. And just kind of pieces out of any obligation to, and so now you have a situation where one partner is controlling the power dynamic of the relationship from the standpoint of just withholding at all any kind of sexual connection. How does that factor into this whole conversation?
Yeah. Again, the big thing is that just doesn't happen. People think it happens, but people in good marriages, they don't withhold for no reason. Now, it could be that one of the reasons, like I gave those 5 reasons, right? One of them is they don't feel emotionally connected during sex. They may not feel emotionally connected because of past trauma, right? They may not feel emotionally connected because they've believed some of these really toxic messages. And for them, seeing a licensed therapist, seeing a trauma counselor, reading The Great Sex Rescue and going through these messages, that might be what they need, because that may be one of the reasons why they're shut off. It might have nothing to do with the marriage. But in general, this idea that if without the obligation sex message, women would just withhold, it's not true. Because let's talk about the 23%. So we had the 58%, he has the higher sex drive, the 19% she does. The 23%, it's not really that it's shared. It's just that nobody can really tell who has the higher sex drive, because this is what a marriage like that looks like, okay? So you're watching Netflix and you're holding hands, you're cuddling while you're watching a movie. And then after the movie's over, you start to kiss and then you end up having sex. Who initiated? No one knows. It just kind of happens. And that's what it looks like in the marriage, because they're a healthy couple. They're getting along. They feel respected. They're looking after each other. They're sharing mental load. They're just doing things. They're doing life well. And so it's not clear who has the higher sex drive, because there's a lot of give and take in the marriage, and they just celebrate each other. If you would ask that woman 10 years ago who has the higher sex drive, she might very well have said him, but they've worked things out. So it's not really clear. And I think that's a really cool picture.
That is.
It's like when the marriage is working, when you've got the mental load shared so she doesn't feel overwhelmed with everything in the family, when they're both getting enough sleep, where they're not super stressed, where they're able to communicate, it's not an issue. So this idea that we need obligation sex or she will stop having sex, if we honestly believe that, then we think sex is terrible and it's not for women anyway.
That I love the picture of that ideal, and kind of where you lose the distinction because the relationship's so healthy, you're drawn together in very organic and natural and authentic ways. In situations, just aware that there are so many relationships that are struggling around this issue. I think it's either the first or second reason cited for divorce. There are situations where, like the one that I mentioned, where one partner is, let's just say, withholding. And so what I'm hearing you say is that it has more to do with getting underneath what's there. So I guess that brings up the next question of, have you encountered a situation where there's a partner who's withholding and also not willing to work out what's underneath?
Yeah. But often that's because of a whole lot of trauma. I see it especially, first of all, to work out what's underneath, often there's repair work that needs to be done. Because if you're in a relationship, for instance, with a man who has been a chronic porn user for 15 years, and he keeps saying he's going to quit, and maybe he does for like a year, and then he starts up again, and he's always berated her about her weight, and he just has been emotionally abusive, and then she's withholding, and she's not willing to work on the sex issue because she doesn't feel safe yet. And when there's not safety in the relationship, you can't work on sex, because sex is at heart an intimate thing, and intimacy requires vulnerability. You can't have vulnerability if you're not safe. So I think often I've seen marriage dynamics where she gets blamed, and sometimes he does. It's more likely her, but it can go either way, for withholding and not being willing to work on it. But when you really dig down, it's because there isn't safety. It's because some of these deeper issues haven't been dealt with. Trust hasn't been rebuilt. Maybe there's been multiple affairs and she's like, I am not going to become vulnerable again. Or maybe there's some sort of emotional abuse going on. And so, yes, I have seen a lot of situations where there's withholding and she's not willing to change. But largely that's because she's waiting for some safety issues to really be dealt with.
Mm-hmm. What role do you see offense playing in some of these like distressed marriages where, just to kind of tease that out a little bit more, where it's, there's been some contention or whatever, and now there are walls of offense that are also kind of barricading these people from each other. So there's the lack of sexual intimacy in the marriage, and then an unwillingness to get underneath that because of offense. Is that something that you see? And how do you speak to those situations?
Oh, absolutely. And the only way around it is increased vulnerability on the part of the person who has caused a lot of the offense. And the problem is, you get into these situations of, who did what first, which doesn't necessarily help. And often I'll hear a lot of, it's men especially, it doesn't always go this way, but he may have been watching porn or using porn for years, but he'll list all the things that she did wrong. But I don't think we realize that when you have a very pornified style of relating, and watching pornography can cause a really pornified style of relating. So you see other people as existing for you. Mm-hmm. And you see her as existing to gratify your desires. You often get angry when your desires aren't met in all kinds of different ways, because the pornified style of relating is very much about entitlement. And that kills a relationship. And so you may be able to point to all the things that she did wrong, but perhaps the reason she was doing those things wrong was out of protection. And if these things are going to be fixed, we first of all need to get to the bottom of entitlement. Mm-hmm. Entitlement is such a huge killer of marriages, of relationships in general. But when you feel like you are entitled to use someone's body, like you are entitled to an easier life than your spouse, your spouse should be working harder than you are, that you are entitled to your spouse's labor, that you are entitled to all of these things, you're going to kill any intimacy. Mm-hmm. And so we need to deal with entitlement, and then we need to be able to get vulnerable. And it's really hard to get vulnerable because so many people, especially those who have been using porn, have often used porn, and you know this, but as a way to distract themselves from what's really going on inside. So they're hiding from shame, they're hiding from deep attachment wounds that they don't want to confront, deep pain, deep rejection, often things that they experienced as kids, because usually porn use starts when you're 11, 12, 13, right? So you've been running from this stuff for years, and you picture this boy when he's 15, and he doesn't make the basketball trials at school, and he comes home and he just feels terrible. And so he watches porn to make himself feel better. And he learns, whenever I feel lousy, porn makes me feel better. Mm-hmm. And so in those formative teenage years, when you're supposed to be learning, hey, this is what I do when I feel rejected. This is how I deal with rejection. This is how I deal with anxiety. He never learns those things because he's gone to porn. Or maybe someone else went to alcohol, or they went to drugs, or they went to overeating, whatever it might be, but you cover up these negative emotions. And then you're in a marriage and you have no idea how to deal with any negative feelings. And you have no idea how to confront what's actually inside you because you've been running from it your whole life. And so your spouse feels like you're hiding because you are. And there's no intimacy. And so you can't get to the root of that until you start looking inside. And that's a scary thing to do because there's years and years and layers on top of it. And because that's so scary, it often drives the porn use because it's another way to, again, hide what I'm feeling inside. So these things are complicated. They're deep and they're messy and they're hard. And I really encourage people to see licensed therapists or people especially trained in undoing all of this stuff, because I've seen so many marriages turn around when people honestly learn how to say what I'm really feeling. Instead of reacting in anger, say, I'm really feeling scared right now. I'm really feeling vulnerable right now. I'm scared you're going to leave me. I'm scared I'm not good enough for you. I'm scared, whatever the emotion might be. When we can't name it, we get angry instead. It's easier. And that just builds the walls.
Hi guys, this is Benji Nolot from Exodus Cry, and I'm just so excited to announce the release of my new book called Raised on Porn. This is something that I've been working on for the past 10 years and just excited to get it into your hands to help deepen your understanding of porn, its impact on our world, on our lives, and what we can do to heal from it. And so I think you're going to find this to be an extremely insightful and helpful resource, whether you are somebody who is struggling with porn consumption, whether you're a parent and wanting to help have better conversations with your kids and protect your kids, whether you're an educator, whether you're in a relationship and this has in some way affected your relationship. I think this book's going to be a super helpful resource. I wrote it in such a way to be that resource that I wish was there when I started into this. So it's both comprehensive and in-depth. And if you're looking for a one-stop shop, so to speak, I think this is that book that you can get a hold of that's really going to give you the big picture and an in-depth way of how porn is affecting our world and us as individuals and our relationships and our children. And again, what we can do to heal, to find freedom, to better our society. And so I encourage you, get a hold of this book, Raised on Porn, and share it with a friend as well. Thanks so much. Just to kind of summarize what I feel like I'm hearing is that safety is maybe the key component of creating a context for sexual intimacy. And there are all these things that contribute towards maybe one or the other of us in the relationship not being safe, whether it was because of maybe a threat at one time to leave, or because of porn use, or because of an affair, or because of, an emotional outburst. There's a lack of a feeling of safety. So it sounds like a lot of the work that needs to be done is around this idea of becoming safe for each other, so that the most vulnerable part of the relationship, the sexual, I don't know, or one of the most vulnerable parts of the relationship, I guess would be like a combination of emotional and sexual vulnerability can happen. But if we're just thinking specifically of like, how do we address sort of the problem of sexless marriages, distressed marriages, marriages where one partner or the other aren't satisfied with the sexual relationship, thinking of that a part of the relationship as being one of the most vulnerable things. How do partners work on becoming safe for each other? What does that look like?
It starts again with emotional intimacy. It starts with being able to be really vulnerable with each other. And sometimes one of you may have a really difficult time with that because you've got, attachment issues, just things from our past, trauma from our past that we haven't dealt with. And so in a marriage, I think when you enter into a marriage, you do commit to working on your stuff. You got to work on your stuff. We all enter marriages with stuff, and some of us have a lot more stuff than others, but you've got to work on your stuff. And that is something that we commit to. Even if your spouse has been the one that has been doing more of the objectively bad things, it doesn't mean that you don't have to work on your own stuff. So we certainly all have to work on our stuff. And if you're married to someone who is not working on their stuff, then it's always a good idea to, go to a counselor and find out what to do, find out good ways to talk about it, figure out your own boundaries, et cetera, because that can be really, really rough to deal with. And if emotional intimacy is just too difficult, practice just friendship. We all know how to be a friend. Sometimes we're not quite sure how to be a husband and a wife because that's a difficult thing. But chances are you know how to be a friend because we've all got friends. And so practice being a friend. What does it look like to be a friend? And be that in your marriage. Do stuff together. Start with some of these basics. I know they sound really basic. It sounds like it has nothing to do with sex, but when we think sex is the problem, it very rarely is. Now, sexual pleasure can be a problem. We can get into all that.
Yeah.
but desire is not usually the problem when there's been these years of walls between you.
Okay, this is my last question on this particular
thing
that we've been discussing. I promise, then we'll move on. But so if the path towards safety is emotional vulnerability, and one partner or the other has a disposition to punish the other one for those moments of vulnerability. In other words, my way of being vulnerable, your way of being vulnerable is to share, a fear, a struggle, a past transgression, whatever it may be. And the disposition of the other partner is to punish that. Then you have a situation where one partner, you believe that the path towards greater intimacy in your marriage is emotional vulnerability, and yet you're fearful of being emotionally vulnerable from a history of being punished for those areas where you're vulnerable. Do you see relationships begin to break down around those dynamics? Is there a way to navigate that?
I think if you're honestly in the middle of that, you need a counselor. Go see a licensed counselor. Okay. Seriously. But yeah, if someone feels punished when they're vulnerable, then they're not safe. And that's when you need to draw boundaries and you need to get some outside help. The only thing that I would say that you could do that hopefully would also work, again, is just really work on friendship. Have some fun. Sometimes we get in such negative cycles in our relationships, we don't even know how to have fun. This is just a really simple, practical thing, okay? This isn't necessarily a fun thing, but it's a way to connect in an easy way. Every day, pick a time of day, always the same time of day. It works best if it's all the same time of day. And share 2 moments with your spouse. The time today where I was the most in the groove. God was working through me. This is what I was put on earth to do. I am amazing. Okay, so the time when you felt the most like that, and the time that you felt the most defeated. Because usually what happens at the end of a day is you say to each other, so what did you do today? And how do you even answer that? Well, I had 6 client meetings. I went to the gym at work. I dropped by the bank. You don't actually know each other any better listing off all your calendar for the day, right? But if you share 2 emotional snapshots, then you are building some vulnerability in a way that isn't necessarily scary. And you let a window in, and you also learn something about yourself. My husband and I started doing this when he worked in a different city for a while. So we would talk on the phone every night. And I found that the moment that I was the most defeated was always the same thing. I always did the same thing. It was when I was checking my email and going through my inbox. And after about a week of that, I realized I need to hire someone to do my email. It was so good, but I would never have realized that if we hadn't been sharing it. So,
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think what a big takeaway for me from your book, having this conversation, is dealing with that mindset that would take license from certain teachings, Bible verses, what have you, that would entitle one partner to say, you are obligated to. So approaching your partner in that entitled way, I think is such an important thing to address that, as well as the psychology of the person who's internalized those teachings to mean I am entitled, which is just going to negatively affect the thing that they're so, and then so addressing that mindset as well. And then I just love the hopeful, optimistic, playful, fun vision of, hey, like there's something underneath this. What if we start by being friends again? Figuring out ways to be safe to each other again. Figuring out safe ways to be vulnerable and including a therapist if that's needed in the process. So, so moving on to points 2, 3, and 4. Now that we have like a few minutes left.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I feel like I feel like on one hand, your message is very simple. I feel like on one hand, like there's some real simple takeaways, but then I also feel like there's so much to unpack with it. So, I don't mean to like belabor these things. I just really enjoy the process of like talking it through with you because you have done so much research. You are such a deep well of understanding around these like very sometimes complex and nuanced issues. So, okay. So point 2, can you remind me of what point 2 is again?
So number 2, a wife should have frequent sex to keep her husband from watching pornography. You want to do that one?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's really tied into the obligation sex message. But what obligation and this message have in common is that they paint sex as a threatening thing for women. Right? If you don't have sex, something bad will happen. And when women have sex to prevent something bad from happening, that's actually coercive. Like that's the definition of coercive sex. So that has all kinds of bad repercussions too. And it lowers libido, it lowers orgasm rates. Because you're having sex out of fear.
So how do you balance, that tension between an objective recognition of the partial truth of that? So like that, bringing sexual satisfaction to my spouse, my partner, one way or the other is providing a realm of covering for them, that, may diminish the possibility of, being distracted by others or, I think our propensity as humans is we're just constantly wandering and, there is this idea that, even part of the idea of marriage is that we would be a covering to each other in that area. So I'm not left so vulnerable in the realm of my sexuality, again, and vice versa, and the part of relationship. So there's an objective sort of recognition of that truth, but then at the same time, the need to say, well, that can't be the reason, even though it's part of the benefit. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to?
It does. I would say though that when you talk to guys especially who have gotten over a porn habit, who are married, what they'll tell you is that sex, once you've gotten over it, it was never really about the sex. Like the times that they were tempted to watch porn in their marriage was much less about how much sex you were getting and was much more about how, whether you felt connected to your spouse. So when you didn't feel connected, when you felt like there was something wrong, that's when you turned to porn. Mm-hmm. When you felt like she was busy with other things and was ignoring you, that's when you turned to porn. It wasn't about sex so much. It was about his own internal emotional state. Because the reasons that you watch porn have very little to do with actual sexual desires or a need for ejaculation or whatever you may want to call it. And it really is more about self-soothing behavior. And so when you learn how to deal with those emotions in other ways, that isn't so much the impetus. So even when you look at Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 7, it says, do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you Satan will not tempt you for your lack of self-control. But, I just, all I can tell you is that every time that we have told women that you're the methadone for your husband's sex addictions, which is what Every Man's Battle literally said. Every Man's Battle is a book series that sold 4 million copies, literally called women the methadone for their husband's sex addictions. And when you do that, you hurt her. And you don't get what you want. You kill her libido. You kill her sexual response. You kill your marital satisfaction. It's just not a healthy way of looking at it.
What's so interesting about this point and the previous point as well is this idea that you do not want to be in a sexual relationship for the reason, the purpose that my sexual engagement with you is the thing that's gonna prevent you from going and watching porn, having an affair, being with the like. You don't want to be in that situation. I don't want to internalize that idea and live that reality out that our sexual relationship is about me preventing or protecting you from going out and having it somewhere else. But at the same time, there's a recognition that part of the benefit of having a healthy sexual relationship is sort of that protection. Is that, I don't know how.
I mean, sex is great. It is wonderful. We should be pursuing it. When we're in a marriage, if you're both having, amazing sex that's satisfying, yeah, you're just going to celebrate. We know that it reduces stress. We know that it helps you feel happier. We know it has all these great benefits. And so I just think that if we can pursue a healthy sexual relationship in the context of a healthy marriage, there's all of these benefits that accrue. But you can't get there using the wrong route. That's the problem. And we're trying to get there using threats and coercion and obligation. And that's actually the opposite of what gets you there.
I love it. I think what part of the reason why I feel like I'm really trying to drill down into this is I'm just deeply aware of how easy we can take certain face value truths, teachings, whatever, internalize those into our own disposition in the way that we approach a situation. So how easy it would be to say, well, objectively, you kind of are obligated to sex. Well, objectively, it kind of does protect. So some people will camp out on that surface level truth, right? Without understanding how detrimental just landing there is, without getting underneath and going, we'll tease that out a bit. That's not the reason you want somebody having sex with you or, yada, yada.
Okay, so, let me give a really good example of this, okay? There's a book in evangelicalism that was quite big called Sheet Music by a guy named Kevin Lehman. And he has this part where he says that a woman's period is a really difficult time for her husband. Now, I want you to picture all of the women that you know. And if you were ever to say to them, hey, I bet your period is really hard on your husband, they would probably hit you because what they're going through. Yeah. Let's just get your head on straight, right? But he goes on to say that her period is a really difficult time for her husband. And so he praised this woman who recognized after 10 years of fighting with her husband over this, that giving him a hand job or oral sex during her period helped him get through this difficult time so that he didn't watch porn for the 5 days when she was on her period. That is the logical extension of talking about how, a woman should have sex so he doesn't watch porn. A woman is obligated. It creates serious selfishness and puts major blinders on. Like when she's crampy and when she is bleeding from her genitals, that should be the priority. And it's even worse because later in the book, he talks about sometimes she just may not be feeling well or she may be postpartum. So she's just pushed a baby out of her body. And he says that this is the time when she can be giving him manual stimulation instead, a hand job, whatever, so that he doesn't feel like he's climbing the walls.
So
why is the priority? Like,
okay.
why is, and this just shows how we have talked about men's supposed need for sexual release. We've elevated that to the highest need, that at her most vulnerable physical time, when she has just pushed a baby out of her, when she's not sleeping, when her milk is still coming in, when she's trying to get used to being a mother, she's probably got tears. She may not even be walking properly. I didn't walk for 7 weeks after my first one, okay? That the priority is supposed to be his sexual release. And if we have any of that mindset, we will kill sex in our marriage, because you're really saying, whatever she is experiencing doesn't matter compared to my great need for ejaculation. So it doesn't matter if you've got a C-section scar and you can barely get out of bed to go to the bathroom. You know, it doesn't matter if you were up 6 hours last night feeding the baby. My needs are preeminent. And that is the way that it is talked about, not just in our evangelical resources, but in our, like, just in our general culture too. And that means that we are seeing what when you see sex as an obligation that she has, you really see women as objectified bodies. You don't see them as whole people with their own experiences.
So mutuality would look like in this situation, first of all, your partner, your spouse is having their cycle and empathizing. Like, that must be painful. That must, like,
Yeah.
right? So like trying to understand what your partner is going through. And the empathy coming back the other way would be, I understand that there's a challenge in that for you as well. It's not the same. It's very different. I understand there's a challenge there for you as well. And so I guess the invitation in that is to self-control. I mean, it's kind of what it sounds like is kind of the obvious this thing. It's not that I would look at my, partner as you are obligated to give me so that I don't or that she would just completely dismiss the idea that there's any challenge or to struggle there at all. But like a mutual understanding of this period of time, and then like an invitation to respect each other through in different ways. So like the one partner embracing self-control, like, there's no obligation to anything. You're not going to go out and find a woman in prostitution because, like you're going to control yourself. Like, and, does that make sense? Like the way that I'm teasing that out?
Well,
like,
we shared a story in the Great Sex Rescue. So one of the co-authors was my daughter, Rebecca, who was our survey developer and who helped write the book. And she shared in the book about, she had a horribly traumatic birth with my grandson, her first child. And she wasn't just out of commission for 6 weeks. Like, this was a really bad tear and it had multiple repercussions. And her husband was just there for her. Like, they went to the midwife appointment at 6 weeks and the midwife took one look at him and said, "You are not to expect sex to resume for quite a while." And she was really hard on him because the midwives do that pretty well up where we're from, But it would never have occurred to him because he was also getting up in the middle of the night to bring the baby to her. He was exhausted too because he was a fully involved dad, and he saw what she went through. And he saw what that did to her body. And he just wanted her to heal. And because of that, she felt so loved and so cherished and so cared for that when she was healed, things were able to get great again because they were on the same page and because they were really serving each other. And that should be the model that we're looking at, is how can we love each other? How can we exercise self-control? How can I work towards what builds intimacy rather than how can I just exert my rights over you?
That's super helpful. And, I keep kind to balance this conversation because I'm just aware of, I think such a big part of our work is identifying in an empathetic way with the experiences of women and children in our world in relationship to their vulnerability within the commercial sex industry. 98% of people being trafficked are women or children. 99% of those doing the buying are men. And so, but I'm also aware of a demographic of men out there, and just trying to understand through both perspectives kind of the nuances of this conversation. And I think kind of the key thing that I keep coming back to is this idea of mutuality, that the empathy goes both ways. And it's not that there isn't a struggle on one side or the other. It's that, there is, but that doesn't mean, like, if the struggle for the husband in that situation, I think what mutuality could look like on the part of the female is like, it's not just an attitude of, hey, I'm going through something, so F off. It's, hey, I'm clearly going through something, and I really appreciate how respectful you are and how patient and self-controlling you are during this time. Does that make sense? Like, yeah. Trying to, like, because...
Can I try to give a vision to the guys who might be listening?
Sure.
Okay. If you're listening to this and you have a real passion for ending sex trafficking, and you know that you don't want to contribute in any way, you don't want to turn to porn anymore, maybe you've struggled with porn in the past and you really want to put that behind you for all kinds of reasons, for the justice reason, for the reason that you want to be faithful to your spouse, whatever. Let me just tell you that the way to put porn behind is so much bigger than just deciding that I'm going to take all the sexual energy I used to spend on porn and put it on my spouse. If you're going to put porn behind, it means laying aside the pornified way of looking at sex. That sex isn't just about your needs. Sex isn't just about your release. Sex isn't just about you feeling good. Sex instead is this deep, intimate knowing of your spouse. And it's fun and it's amazing. But at its heart, it cannot be separated from this deep, intimate knowing. And that means that she has to matter. What she's experiencing has to matter, just as what you're experiencing has to matter. But it's about both of you together. It's not about you using her. And when you can let go of that idea of using or seeing her as just a means to an end, it's a scary thing because you may feel like if I let go of that, I'm never going to get sex again. But believe me, when you let go of that, it's almost like you used to be colorblind and now you can suddenly see color. It's this whole new world opens to you because finally you're able to experience real intimacy. And you're able to know what it is just to be able to rest and be at peace with someone who loves you and knows you and sees all that you are and still says, I accept you. But you can't get there until you give up entitlement. And I know that's scary, but take the plunge because it is so worth it.
So good. I wish we had like 6 hours to do this because we've barely scratched the surface of what is essentially a homogenous teaching within the evangelical church around this idea of like obligation sex that filters through most of the predominant books on sex in the church, so on and so forth. Now you're introducing another idea, this idea of the pornographic consciousness that kind of permeates our world. Whether or not somebody's ever looked at pornography in their entire life, and how that factors into this. So there we are in this very unique sense as a generation having to navigate a lot of things. And, in a perfect world, we wouldn't be influenced by false teachings. We wouldn't be influenced by something as harmful and poisonous and destructive as pornography. But the fact is that we are. And so I just think that for people out there, the extent to which they have been exposed to maybe some of these evangelical teachings or false teachings in other religions or even in secularized contexts, the influence of pornography and how that's affected our mindset. There's just a lot that we have to navigate through in the midst of this perfect storm. And so part of what I really appreciate about, your message is not just deconstructing some of the false mindsets that we've developed because of these teachings, because of pornography, because of other things, but also just pointing towards what is the path towards what we're really wanting and needing, intimacy, authentic connection, a relationship that's truly fulfilling for both partners. And I think that, having that kind of aspirational outlook is just a really like hopeful way to kind of frame this conversation that otherwise just feels like, in some ways, like hopeless. It's like, dang, like we really are dealing with a lot. And I guess for my part of what I'm feeling right now, even as we just wrap this up, is like, I just feel just compassion for everyone. I'm like, we are all in this really effed up world right now. There's a lot that we need to navigate. So I think for men, just like, if you could be realistic about that, like, stop with all the entitled nonsense. And, there's some really toxic men's movement stuff out there, and just understand that, like, yeah, we're dealing with a lot. The thing that's going to bring us fulfillment is not being able to point out just the faults of the opposite gender, one way or the other. It's finding that path towards true fulfillment in the context of a relationship. So I love that you just keep bringing us back there. I found that to be like really hopeful and helpful. In the last like couple minutes that we have here, could you just maybe give one more summary of the last 3 points that we haven't mentioned? And hopefully at some point we'll be able to have another conversation where we keep pulling this apart, because there's a lot to discuss.
Well, let me give you, let me do it this way. Is we've talked a lot about men's struggles with, how to see sex differently. A lot of what the Great Sex Rescue does is I'm just inviting women to look at how these messages have really killed their sexuality. Like, women were created to be sexual beings. But when we grow up feeling like, I need to make sure that no guy ever lusts after me, I need to make sure that if we're ever making out, he doesn't go too far. So I can't, so you're making out, you're 17 years old, you're in a car, you're making out. And her thoughts are, is he getting too excited yet? Do I need to stop him yet? Where are his hands? Like, she's thinking about what he's doing. She's not thinking about her. Because that's the dynamic that we've built up, that she is the one who has to be the brakes. He's the accelerator. She has to be the brakes. And then you get married and you have no idea how to be the accelerator. You have no idea how to experience sexual pleasure. And it's so easy for him. Most guys tend to want sex, and sex doesn't take very long. They're ready to go right away. And so you start feeling like, I'm broken. I am broken. I'm not a sexual being. It doesn't work for me. There's something wrong with me. And what we did in the Great Sex Rescue is we tried to show women and men, there's nothing wrong with her. There's nothing wrong with her. We just need to have a different approach. We need to understand that sex is not only about his ejaculation. Like, it needs to be about her pleasure too. Let's deal with the orgasm gap, because we got a big one. We got a 47-point orgasm gap. He orgasms 95% of the time and not her. Like, it's bad, So let's deal with this. Let's stop all these negative emotions that we're putting on women. You're broken. You need to have sex because otherwise he's going to have an affair. What's wrong? Like, why would anybody want to have sex when all these messages are coming down on her? And instead, let's pull all that back and let's just get back to what it was meant to be. Let's just learn to have fun again. And you can get there.
That's so helpful.
And that's what this is really about. If you read all the reviews on Amazon, if you go to Amazon, there's like over 2,000 now. I think the most common word is validating. It's just so validating, because so many of us feel so alone with our sex problems. We don't talk to other people about it, and it's okay to feel broken. It's okay to feel confused, but don't stay there, because there is a way forward.
That's so helpful. There was this study done that Caroline Heldman cited in a conversation I had with her, and the study showed that men's and women's sex drives were actually not all that different. And it was an interesting study because what it showed is then well, why, if men's and women's sex drives are actually not all that different, then why are there bikini barista stands and not, men in Speedos stands? And why is there Hooters and not the male version of Hooters? And she talked about this idea that because what's at work in these situations is not just sexual, it's men purchasing power over women. And I think that's another aspect of this conversation, the role of power in the dynamics of a relationship. And so we'll have to save that thread for another time. But I do really appreciate everything that you're excavating, uncovering, messaging about. And my hope, maybe I am just overly conscious of how men internalize things. I really want our male audience to just take a moment, not to be sensitive, not to be defensive, not to be reactionary, to take a deep breath, to calm ourselves, to be humble, to be empathetic, to consider the perspective of what women are living through as a result of evangelical teachings, pornography, and many, many social constructs over decades, and how that maybe has affected them. And what we can do as men to be more empathetic, be more sensitive, practice more self-control, be more safe, create more space for safety in a relationship, on and on. So, all right. Last word. Any last words?
Oh gosh. No, I just think we can get there. I think the next generation is going to get us there. I think there's so much awareness of how totally messed up all this is. And I don't think people want to stay stuck. And so I have confidence. The conversations are changing.
Yeah.
So I have confidence, and I think we're going to get there. But we're not going to get there by covering it up. We're not going to get it there by just wishing it changed. We're not going to get there by keeping doing what we've always been doing. We got to talk about it. We got to get real. We got to get vulnerable, and we'll get there.
So good.
We will.
Awesome. Thank you, Sheila. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
You can check out all our podcast episodes, articles, and films at exoduscry.com and join the daily conversation by following Exodus Cry on all major social platforms.